Okay. All right. So Dhruv, help us out. What's the primary conflict between Ambedkar and Gandhi?
So Ambakar is pretty pro what's it called, lower castes rights. Well, Gandhi is more of a traditionalist and believes that those of lower castes don't actually deserve the rights, and claims that all are children of God, and that those who are in a lower caste are simply just people who are being punished for being what's it called, people who are just punished for misbehaving in their past life.
Yeah, yeah. I think you are absolutely right there. What we really need to focus is that Gandhi's the traditionalist, right? Gandhi is actually going to support the caste system. He wants to keep the caste system. He wants to make the caste system a little bit less brutal, right? He wants to make it less brutal, but he does support the caste system. So, all right, so let's go post independence now. In the post independence world, we're going to get a bunch of stuff that we're going to see kind of parallels. Okay. So, first, let's look at this Dalit movement. Okay. This Dalit Buddhist movement. Ambedkar is actually going to convert to Buddhism. He converts to Buddhism, and he actually founds a new branch of Buddhism called Navayana Buddhism. Buddhism in the world today has three main branches. Mahayana Buddhism, which is like China, which is like Chinese Buddhism, right? Theravada Buddhism, which is like Myanmar and Sri Lanka, right? And then Vajrayana Buddhism, which is like Tibet and Mongolia, right? So Ambedkar starts what's called Navayana Buddhism, which is the Dalits of India, essentially. And he basically says that Hinduism is the tool of the oppressor, that Hinduism is used by the wealthy, the powerful, to hold people down and to hurt them, right? Does that sound quite a bit like Malcolm X, right? When Malcolm X is talking about Christianity, Ambedkar is talking about Hinduism in the same way, right? This is why Malcolm X converts to Islam, and this is why Ambedkar converts to Buddhism. And when he does convert Buddhism, he brings a lot of Dalits with him, quite a few. Okay. You're also going to get another parallel. The Dalits are going to form the Dalit Panther Party, and this should look familiar as well because it's copying the Black Panther Party, right? This is the Black Panther Party from the United States. And the Black Panther Party was founded in order to fight police violence, right? Where they're fighting against police violence and following cops. Well, the Dalit Panther Party is also fighting police violence and following cops, right? Eventually, it becomes like a full political party, but that's where it starts off in the beginning. We have two vocab words we need to get real quick. So the first is called what Indians call vote bank. This is a term that Indians use. And vote bank basically means everyone votes for their own caste, that nobody votes outside of their caste, essentially. So this means that Dalits basically have no chance of ever getting elected, right? They're never going to get elected because of this vote bank concept. This is not like a legal mandate. It's not like a law. It's just tradition. And it's a tradition that's so deeply ingrained that Indians gave it a name. All right. Next is reservations. So when we use reservations most of the time this year, it's been bad. Like we think of like a Native American reservation in the United States, or we think of like a Bantustan in South Africa, right? But reservations in India is different. Reservations in India is positive discrimination within the political system in order to reserve seats for the Dalits or reserve money for the Dalits. So it's positive discrimination meant to help the Dalits. So this would be something like India passes a bill raising, $100 billion worth of education money, right? And then they would say 20% of that money is a reservation for the Dalits. That means 20% of the $100 billion goes towards Dalit schools. You guys with me on that? Okay. These are the three big Dalit laws. These are the three biggest ones: the NPE, the Prevention of Atrocities, and the Protection of Civil Rights. There are a lot of Dalit laws, but these are the three that are kind of the most likely to appear on a test. So the National Policy of Education is basically trying to increase education across the country, but it spends a lot of it is focusing on Dalit education, right? Dalits have the highest illiteracy rate, the highest rate of like dropping out of school, right? Of course. When they pass this, 1986, they find that adult female Dalits, have a 14% literacy rate. 1-4, 14% literacy, right? And that's literacy in any language. Okay, so this is really, really bad. Okay, it has been improving, right? Female Dalits, the lowest performing group in India, female Dalits are now up to like 30% literate. So that's good. That's an improvement, right? It's taken 30 years to get there, but here we go. All right, next is the Prevention of Atrocities Act. This makes like anti-Dalit violence, hate crimes, essentially what Americans would call hate crimes. And so it's trying to prevent atrocities, trying to prevent violence. And then the Protection of Civil Rights, this is a lot like the Civil Rights Act of 1965, where they're trying to protect Dalits' rights to like own property, to vote, to participate in the government, that kind of stuff. Okay. The United Nations, I'm moving on. You guys ready? Give me a thumbs up if you're ready. We're good? Cool. Ilha, is your eye like broken? Like what's going on with your eye, man?
It's fine. It just like hurts a little because I was like, it's fine.
You're looking like you're having eyeball problems, my friend. Okay. Or you're just winking at me. Maybe you're winking at like Raul. All right. Well, hey, whatever. You guys live your life. Live your life, but let's do Dalit stuff first. All right. So you guys can wink at each other later if you'd like. Okay. By far and away, the most consistently bad problem for the Dalits is police violence, police brutality towards them. Okay. The United Nations Human Rights Commission recognizes that police violence against Dalits is incredibly bad. Also, the National Human Rights Commission, this is from India, the National Human Rights Commission of India, they also recognize that police violence is incredibly bad. Okay. And the police violence this is going to sound familiar to you because we've seen this in the United States and we've seen this in South Africa, right? The police violence the police are regularly arresting Dalits more than anyone else. They're beating Dalits, they're killing Dalits, right? They're murdering Dalits for like little stuff. There was a report out of India just like 2 months ago where there's a police officer who was forcing a Dalit to crawl on the ground and eat poop and drink. The police officers were like peeing into a cup and making him drink their urine, right? And they were doing it in front of like all these witnesses, and the crowd was just kind of laughing and cheering them on, right? This isn't like back in the 19th century. This is like a month ago, right? Dalit violence is incredibly common. Incredibly anti-Dalit police brutality against Dalits is incredibly common. This picture here is from a really high-profile case last summer. The Black Lives Matter movement, of course, was going around the world. You can see them wearing their COVID masks and stuff, right? And this is the Dalit Lives Matter movement, which is the same kinds of issues, right? Very similar kinds of issues. And this particular one here was a young Dalit girl who was gang raped by the police, and then the police lit her on fire. they lit her on fire, and then they tried to claim that because they had lit her on fire, they couldn't find any semen inside of her, which meant that she wasn't actually raped, even though there was like 15 witnesses. Right? So the brutality is as bad as you'd think it is. Okay. India regularly is ranked in like the bottom 10% of all countries on earth for police brutality. Okay. Like India, I think the UN, when they did the ranking, it was like 2015, they had India ranked as third from the bottom for police brutality. Okay. So the police in India are really problematic, and most of this violence is anti-Dalit violence. Okay. To give you some numbers here, all of the Dalit, all of the scheduled castes, like the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backwards classes, right? If you combine them together, they're somewhere around 25% of the population. And yet they occupy, no shock here, 55% of the prison population. They also occupy 70% of the death row population, right? And when the police are confronted about it, the police all say, I'm not prejudiced. I'm just arresting the people who are committing crimes. The Dalits are the ones committing crimes, so they're the ones I arrest, right? Sound familiar, right? This should sound pretty familiar because we heard this in South Africa. We heard this in the United States. We're going to hear this in Ireland as well, right? That this is kind of a universally bad thing. So I think that's a good place to leave this. We're basically done with the Dalits. We could like do a whole year on just Dalit stuff, right? But you know, I don't think that I need to give you like a list of police atrocities. I think that you're gonna understand that already. All right. Do you guys want to talk? You guys want to do outline stuff? Okay. So let's do some outline stuff. Let's do some outline stuff. Why don't we, Ilha, why don't you start us off? What's the first question?
Analyze the influence of caste on the development of Indian democracy after the 1950s.
Okay. All right. Analyze the influence of caste on the development of democracy. All right. So let's get going. Yash, do you have a nice thesis statement for this one?
I guess you could say that the caste system in India has a negative impact on democracy because it systematically oppresses the lower class while maintaining the positions of higher classes. And you could also add in some stuff about how the government protections aren't adequate towards making sure that the population is safe, I guess.
All right. That's an okay thesis. It's not a fully complete thesis, right? A good thesis should have argument, evidence, 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 right? X is true because of Y, A, B, and C, right? The way Yash phrased that, I heard one evidence, and then I heard one evidence that I'm not sure counts, right? So let's try to make a thesis that has three things in it. Raul, what do you have in your thesis for this one?
I did not do, I didn't feel confident in my ability. I just did like some chicken scratch for this one. The other ones I did some writing and thesis and whatnot,
Okay.
but not for this one.
Okay, Dhruv, can you help your brothers out here? All right, Dhruv, what you got?
Because of the uneven distribution of wealth between the castes and because of the police brutality, the caste system hindered the development of Indian democracy in the 1950s.
Okay, so I think that that's good. You can say that the caste system hinders democracy because uneven wealth distribution. I think that's a really good one, right? And I think police brutality is a really good one, though. I guess you have to make an argument that the caste is causing the brutality, which is where Yash was going with, but the way you phrased it wasn't exactly. I think that if you were typing it out, you'd be fine, right? But the way you were phrasing it wasn't 100% there. You have to make the argument that the caste is causing that, right? In this case, it's the upper caste causing the violence because they're trying to maintain their order, right? You just have to be clear when you say that. Otherwise, it's not connected. So uneven wealth and property, brutality, and then what else? What was the other one you said, Yash?
Um,
Oh, you had maintains that the caste is self-maintaining, right? That it's self-maintaining, which is, I think, a good overall statement to make. But what's one more really good example of how the caste system is hurting democracy? We have wealth, we have violence. What else do we have? Mike, what you got?
Um, is there some way to talk about like that religion, that conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar somehow?
You cut out. I couldn't hear everything you said. You say it again.
Is there some way to use the conflict between Gandhi and Ambedkar as one of the three things somehow?
Yeah, I think so, right? And I think that you can use that as maybe a counter argument, right? Possibly, where you can say that India is attempting to enfranchise the scheduled castes by giving them seats,
Mm.
but I'm not totally convinced that that's actually helping them. I'm not Ambedkar definitely thought it was helping, right? But I'm not 100% convinced it is helping. But I think that you should put something in there about that. The reservations for the scheduled castes.
Right.
I think that's a really strong thing to put in there, and I don't think that you have to be fully in favor of one side or the other on that. I think you can be ambiguous a little bit, as long as it's clear you know what you're talking about. Okay, let's move to the next question. Raul, let's start us off. You're going to do the next question. Read it for us.
Okay. Evaluate the rise of the BJP party after its formation in 1980.
Okay, didn't I say Raul? That's okay.
Oh,
All right.
okay.
Okay, that's fine. All right, so evaluate the rise of the BJP. Okay. All right, Ilha, what you got for the rise of the BJP?
I don't have like a complete thesis, but mine was like the rise of the BJP after its formation in 1980 was gained mainly through other like support from similar groups such as like the Hindutva and like the spreading like concept of
Okay.
Hindutva.
Okay. All right. Groove, what are you going to say?
I was gonna say the BJP rose because of the original, so because of the disfigurement of Indira Gandhi, the right-wing part of the INC ended up shifting towards what was once a more smaller version of an originally fascist version of the BJP, and then once all those were Indian right-wingers ended up shifting to the BJP, and it ended up rising and becoming less fascist. So I would say the original reason was because of Gandhi and her terrible dynasty.
Because of Indira Gandhi. Yeah.
Indira Gandhi and her terrible
Yeah,
dynasty.
we have to make sure which Gandhi we're calling terrible here, right? Okay, we got lots of Gandhis. We got to make sure we're calling the correct one terrible. All right, so I think Drew, I think that your instinct is good on that, right? When you're answering this question, you have to kind of think of this as a parallel causes, right? If we're going to talk about the BJP rising, then you need to tell me what the BJP is doing to grow. If it's like a crazy right-wing conspiracy place, it's not going to grow, right? It's going to live in like crazy, almost fascist town, right? It has to moderate itself. It has to take a more moderate stance. It has to move itself to the center. Otherwise, it can't grow. Is that, you guys with me on that? Like, they're not going to grow by being extremists. Like, there just aren't that many extremists. You have to move to the middle. Okay. So the first part of your answer has to be what they're doing to moderate themselves. The second part of your answer has to be what is happening in order to give them the space to grow, right? Because you have a limited number of people. If 70% of the population are part of the INC, then you have to take people from the INC to grow. Otherwise, you're just not going to grow, right? So something has to happen to the INC, and that's where Drew was going. Drew was answering that second part of the question, right? That second part of the conception is that the INC is largely starting to crumble because of the Nehru dynasty, because it's that 40 years of the same party, of the same, excuse me, of the same party, of the same family, of the same issues, you know, like people are just kind of sick and fed up with Nehru's family, especially after Indira. Like Indira really is problematic. She has a real problematic influence on the party, right? So by the time we get to the 1980s, we have a situation where the INC is starting to crumble, and just like Drew said, that right side of the INC is looking for a new home, right? So right as the INC is crumbling and the right side is looking for a new home, so too at the same time is the BJP rising with a new moderate message. And that new moderate message says, hey, we're not the crazy terrorist psychos from 40 years ago. We are a newer, kinder, gentler, conservative India. And so that right side of the INC joins them. Does that make sense to you guys? You guys with me on that? I think there's one other really big reason why Modi gets elected, right? Who's prime minister before Modi?
Manmohan Singh,
Manmohan Singh. And what party was Manmohan Singh?
Indian National Congress.
Yep, he's the INC. And other than being an INC who's not Nehru, who's not a Nehru family member, right? What really stands out about Manmohan Singh?
He was a Sikh, right?
Yeah, he is a Sikh. He's still alive. Yeah,
Or-
but he's a Sikh. He's the first non-Hindu prime minister, right? So you might cheer and say, "Congratulations, India, on embracing some of your diversity," right? That might be cool, but it's also going to cause this huge identity backlash because the Hindus are going to say, "Whoa, hold on." The INC is always talking about globalism. It's always talking about the world. It's always talking about all Indians. Well, you know what? I'm not all Indians. I'm me. And I don't like the idea that this Sikh is sitting in that office, right? Because he doesn't speak for me. He's not like me. He's something different, right? The same way that Barack Obama, a black man, produces that right-wing backlash, which is Trump in the United States, the same pendulum swinging back and forth. Same thing with India. That pendulum swings by having a Sikh, right? And then a bunch of Hindus are going to say, whoa, I didn't agree to have a Sikh in charge. And then they swing it back the other way. Okay. I think that is another component of the rise. Does that seem good to you guys? You seem okay? Okay. Raul, this time. Raul, can you read the third question for us?
Yeah. To what extent is the conflict over Kashmir an example of the typical push and pull factors affecting the development of post-independence Indian democracy?
All right. This question by far and away was the biggest headache for all the people in class, right? Because it's a tricky question. Okay, so let me help you with some of the vocabulary first. Push and pull factors, they're not talking about migration, right? Like a lot of you guys who took AP geography, you all think it's migration. It's not that. Okay. It's what AP geography calls centripetal forces and centrifugal forces, right? So push factors are things that push India together. They hold India together. Okay. So things that make India more unified. Pull factors are things that are pulling India apart, that are tearing India apart, that make India more divided. Does that help clear that question up a little bit for you? right? The in-person classes all had a rough time with this question. This was the question that caused a lot of complaints in class because of that. Now, what is the question asking you? Look at the question carefully. What is this asking you? Yash, what's this question specifically asking you?
So it's asking whether Kashmir is whether Kashmir is traditional in the sense that it has something to do with pushing India together and pulling India apart as a part of democracy. But I guess in this case, you don't have to, since it's to what extent, you don't have to agree with this statement.
Right. So it's asking you whether or not the Kashmir conflict is typical or not of other Indian conflicts, right? We have a lot of Indian conflicts we've talked about, right? We have conflicts in Andhra Pradesh, we have conflicts in Tamil Nadu, we have conflicts in Maharashtra, in Gujarat, in Punjab, right? We have conflicts with the Dalits, right? We have a lot of conflicts. Is Kashmir typical or is Kashmir not typical? What do you think? Anybody? What do you think? Is Kashmir typical or not typical?
It's typical.
Drew says it's typical. Okay. Yash, what are you saying?
I would say it's kind of not typical, mainly because there's a lot of external factors relating to like the conflicts going on. It's not internalized in India, I would say.
Yeah, I think Yash's answer is the easier answer, right? I think Drew, you can make the argument that it is typical, but that seems like a much more difficult argument to make to me. But I think Yash hit the nail right on the head that the Kashmir conflict is unique. It's not a very typical conflict, right? And Yash also gave us the number one reason why Kashmir is unique. It's unique because it's a foreign conflict, right? It's not just domestic, it's foreign. There's all sorts of Pakistani troops there, right? Are there any Pakistani troops in Tamil Nadu? No. Or Maharashtra or Gujarat? No, right? When the students in Andhra Pradesh start to protest, are the Pakistani soldiers there backing the students? No. Right? So I think that the easiest answer is to say that it's not typical. In this case, what you would say is that Kashmir is not typical because it promotes disunity in India for this reason, disunity in India for this reason, and unity in India for this reason. Right? Push, push, pull. Or flip it, right? Pull, pull, push. That's fine, right? Or you can say it's typical because it pushes India this way, but it's not typical because it pulls India this way and pulls India that way. Right? And your answer, it's a to what extent answer, so it probably should have typical, typical, not typical, right? It should have that counter argument built into it, right? Typical, typical, not typical, or the reverse, not typical, not typical, typical. Okay? Are you guys feeling okay about that question? That's the question by far and away that the in-person people had a hard time with. Yeah, Drew, what do you want to say?
Wait, could you also say that an example of actually being typical is that, like the other protests and stuff in India, the Kashmir conflict also brought a sense of nationalism among many Indians.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty strong argument. I think that Kashmir maybe more than any other conflict is a, brings up those nationalist sentiments, right? There's nothing that makes an Indian politician more popular than kicking Pakistan's ass, right? Like, if you can really stick it to Pakistan, then you're going to get a lot of votes. You know what I mean? So yeah, Drew, I think in that way it's absolutely typical. I think. Yeah.
And could you cite like Indira Gandhi's didn't she went to war with Pakistan over this and then she got more votes as a result of it?
Oh yeah, I think that's pretty strong evidence. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is strong evidence. If you want to make that argument that it is typical in those ways, right? I think that that's a perfectly fine. In fact, that's exactly how I would make the argument too. Yeah. You guys feel okay on this question? Yeah. All right. Who hasn't read a question yet? Ilha, did you read a question? Yeah. Dhruv, I don't think you've read a question. Go ahead and read the next question for us.
The far-left ideology of Jawaharlal Nehru and his daughter Indira Gandhi represented a serious threat to Indian democracy. Discuss.
Okay. All right. Ro, what you got here? You got a thesis for me?
Yeah. So basically, the far left ideology of Nehru and Indira Gandhi did not, but their ideologies did not represent a serious threat to Indian democracy. However, Indira Gandhi's actions did when she twisted the meanings and intended, or changed the meanings and intended actions of the on paper and face value of her platform when she was running for office and took different action.
Okay.
The tail end of that was messy, but yeah.
Okay, so you're gonna make a distinction between her actions and her ideology, right? That her belief structure is not the problem; it's the way she carried out that belief structure is the problem, right? Okay, all right. I think you can make a good argument for that, right? Does anyone have another one, a different kind of answer for that? Yeah, go Drew.
Although Nehru did not represent a serious threat to democracy because of his far-left ideology, because of Indira Gandhi's many, I guess, violations or infringements on democratic ideals, such as forced sterilizations, election fraud, and interference with judicial processes, she did in fact represent a serious threat to Indian democracy, and her actions were very clear of her ideals.
Okay, so Drew is choosing to not divorce her ideology from her action, right? Drew's doubling down on that, right? I think that that's okay too. I think that the key to answering this question well is to acknowledge both Nehru and Gandhi, right? The students who are doing a bad job on this question, well, I haven't read any of them this year, but if I remember correctly from last year, the students who read this last year, who wrote this last year, the ones who did a bad job are the ones who only talked about Indira, right? And they just said Indira was bad because of A, B, and C, right? That's a super easy argument to make. But Nehru is a little bit trickier, okay? And a lot of Indians will make the argument that Nehru was not very good in some ways, right? Because Nehru, a lot of conservative, like BJP, Modi type people will say Nehru wasn't very good because Nehru was very friendly with the Soviet Union. He was creating the economic 5-year plans in a Soviet style. Nehru was very comfortable with the government telling businesses what to do. He was very comfortable with that kind of stuff, right? But Nehru also had this kind of like regulating aspect of him that Nehru was very little d democratic, right? Like he very much did believe in elections and like liberties of people, right? And that's something that his daughter goes more extreme. Okay, I think that your answer needs to acknowledge that Nehru was pretty far left and he was pretty pro-Soviet, he was pretty pro-communist, right? But he had that personal kind of regulator that kept him from being a full-blown communist. And his daughter is a matter of degrees, right? So she is the product of his ideology, but she didn't have that regulating effect on her, or not as much anyway. Right? I think in order to be a really good answer, you need to acknowledge both. Okay? And yeah, go Ro.
So whenever we talk about the Soviet Union, is it just like bad every time? Is there just because every time you I just hear you talk about it, there's always like something bad attached to it. So, for example, just now you were like, the conservatives didn't say, they said it was bad for Nehru to associate himself with the U.S. With the Soviet Union and have those communist ideologies.
Yeah. So I would say that the Soviet Union is basically always bad when we're talking about democracy, right? If the realm of what we're talking about is what will strengthen democracy, then the Soviet Union is always a force for anti-democracy. I can't think of any way in which the Soviet Union helps democracy. Not really. I think the Soviet Union basically always hurts democracy because the Soviet Union is itself, by definition, anti-democratic. Right? Does that make sense to you? Right? I think that there's a lot of like you can make a pretty strong argument that the Soviet Union, that like left wing economics is probably better, right? Like maybe capitalism isn't a universal good, right? Like I think you can make an argument that Soviet economics maybe has some strengths to it and some stuff like that, and that there's a lot of things about the Soviet Union that are appealing, right? The equality of people, especially things like minority rights and women's rights and stuff, right? The Soviet Union's very strong on those. The Soviet Union's also very strong on things like education, very strong on education. One of the best places in the world for education, actually, right? But if what we're talking about is democracy, then the Soviet Union is basically a universal bad. Does that make sense, Ro? Yeah. And this question is basically a question, kind of teasing out what conservative and what liberal Indians might think. Yeah, that's what the question's kind of aiming for. Okay, Yash, do we have one more question, right? I think. Yeah, go ahead and read our last question for us.
Evaluate the role of student and youth movements in the evolution of democracy in post-independence India.
Okay, all right. Ilha, why don't you give us your starting point on this?
Oh, sorry. I said that their like student and youth groups played a pretty important role in the evolution of democracy since they like helped movements such as in like Andhra Pradesh, where I think there are during the language movement there are a couple of like college student groups there.
Sure.
Then couldn't really think of any others for so far, but
Okay, so you could answer it with student language groups in Tamil Nadu and in Andhra Pradesh and in Maharashtra and in Gujarat, right? So you could answer it that way if you wanted to, right? Do we have other student groups that we can talk about? Dhruv? Or was that where you're going to go?
I was just gonna say, although student and youth groups play an important role in the evolution of democracy in post-independence India, student and youth groups mainly played a role in the linguistic movements of India.
Okay, so I think we have student groups in other things as well, right? And the bell rang, and I have a parent here, so I'm going to wrap this up really quickly, right? But we have students involved in the Khalistan movement, the Sikh Khalistan movement. We have students there. We also have students involved in getting Indira Gandhi elected, and we also have students involved in opposing Indira Gandhi once she, kind of goes nuts, right? We also have student groups involved in the Hindutva movement, right? That the RSS has student movements attached to it, and so does the BJP. And so the rise of conservatism is also led by students. Okay. And we also have a lot of student movements involved with the Dalits as well. So I think there's a lot of options for how to answer this question. The linguistic answer is kind of the most obvious, I think, but we have a lot of options. A lot of options. I think a really good answer will probably acknowledge that the student groups are operating in different capacities. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. The code for the test, You guys ready for it? The code for the test is Taj Mahal with the capitals and a space. So I'll help you out. It's capital T and then AJ space capital MAHAL. Cool? All right, please do the test tonight. I want to grade them tomorrow. Cool? Are we good? All right. On that note, I will see you gentlemen later.